Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this episode of What Is on My Wrist, we are talking about a Tiffany signed Rolex GMT reference 16750 from 1985. This is one of the nicest GMTs that I think we've ever had in our collection here at Craft and Tailored. And what is even cooler about it is the watch is co-signed with the Tiffany Co branding. So I wanted to, one, highlight this watch because it is a superb example that remains fully unpolished and is also a transitional model, being that it's a 16750, but also it's a Tiffany stamped version of the watch, which is also very interesting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the 16750, talk about what to look for in an unpolished watch, but also talk a little bit about Tiffany co-signed watches and the history behind that and all that stuff. So let's get into the details, shall we? The Rolex GMT reference 16750 was the model that replaced the Rolex reference 1675. What's interesting is that the model was first introduced in 1979 and it was in production until 1988. And the main difference between the 1675 and the 16750 is the quick set caliber 3075, which essentially is a hacking date function. So instead of rolling the hands around in 24-hour intervals to flip the date wheel, you can quickly set the date. And similar to like a 16800 or a 16660 Sea Dweller, those watches also featured a quick set caliber of movement, much like the 16750. Diving back into the dial variants, the first dial variant that we will see in the 16750 is a matte dial variant, which is basically a carryover from the 1675. Then what we see is the introduction of the glossy dial with the white gold tritium luminous filled surrounds. And the first variants basically say Oyster Perpetual on them underneath the Coronet and Rolex. They're basically non-date versions of the 16750 printed on the first series of the dial. Whether that was an error or whether that was an intentional element of design by Rolex, that's the second variant of the glossy white gold surround dial that we see. So essentially, again, underneath the Rolex, you'll see Oyster Perpetual, and then underneath that, you'll see GMT, Master Superlative Chronometer officially certified, but it won't say date. And the third variant of that says, basically you have the Coronet, Rolex, and then it says Oyster Perpetual date, which is more in line with how Rolex signs the dials based on the reference of watch. And again, the only difference outside of just some of the design cues between the 1675 and the 16750 is the caliber 3075, which again allows that instantaneous advancement of the date. This specific 16750 is from 1985, and the watch is absolutely stunning. What's interesting about the watches that we see in 84 and 85 or in the earlier 16750 glossy white gold surrounds is there's a phenomenon known as spidering. So this is kind of the era and time in which we see spider dials, and we can see that in the 5513s and other references kind of in this time frame. And essentially what the spider dial is a flaw in the lacquer where it expanded and contracted, probably due to temperature fluctuation. And it created kind of this like spider webbing or look of like black cracked glass. And it's a really interesting look. Looking at the watch straight on, in many cases, you won't be able to see it, but if you get it into, kind of like the reflection or the sunlight, you'll see like this kind of like spider webbing that kind of starts from the center post of the dial, or the center hole in the dial where the post and the hand stack is, and it kind of like spreads out through the dial, and it's a really cool effect. What's really cool about this watch, and something that I've really come to love about this watch in this specific example, is that the case is just an example of what a watch from this era should look like. if it remains unpolished. In many cases, these watches are polished, and and that's common for watches out of this era. And not a total deal breaker, but people often are like, is the watch unpolished? Does the watch retain its original case geometry? In many cases, people don't know what an unpolished watch looks like, and they yet ask if the watch is unpolished. I'd like to kind of leverage this example, not just due to the fact that it's a Tiffany dial, but also due to the fact that it's a really nice case study for what a 16750 and or what a case out of this era in the sport range of Rolex watches should look like. So the first thing that I look at, and what most people look at, is do we see a chamfer down the side of the lugs? And what the chamfer is basically on the top side of the lugs, you have brushing, and then you have basically this like milled or almost like chiseled line that separates the side of the case from the top side of the lugs. So, obviously get yourself a good loop, and then if we loop, what you'll basically see is that factory brushing on the top side of the lugs, and then kind of this geometric angle that runs from the side of the case down the lugs. The second thing that I actually look at is where the lug hole is placed on the side of the watch. So I basically hold the watch like this, right? And I look at where the lug hole sits between the top side of the lug and the bottom side of the lug. And if a watch has been polished, typically what you'll see is you'll start to see that hole kind of float either to the top or the bottom of the lug, depending on where the watch has received the most polishing. So on this specific example, we see nice, even, symmetrical, lug holes that are like literally in the middle of the lug as it would have come from factory. Another thing too that I do is I feel the watch. I run my fingers over the watch, and for example, the underside of the lugs are still very sharp. Not sharp to the point where they're going to cut your finger, but if you run your finger over the case like this, you can feel a hard edge there. It's not soft, it's not smooth. I mean, there's like a definitive kind of almost like milled edge. The other thing too that is important is to look at the bottom side of the case. So if we look at the bottom side of this watch, you'll see interesting kind of factory mill marks and finishing details that you won't see if the watch has seen a polishing wheel. So a little bit about that. Also, the bezel kind of has like that almost like Coke bottle type of feel to it, which is a good indication that the watch has not been polished, as a watch that, if it has been polished, will obviously lose those details. Another key element is on the crown guards. You'll actually see almost like a chamfer or a hard line on the top side of basically the crown guards. As the crown guard starts to fold down from the top side of the case, you'll actually see a finishing detail in a brushing that often is lost when the watch hits a polishing mill. So in any case, I wanted to kind of highlight those details and use this as a bit of a case study example for a watch that has not been polished and retains its original factory finishing. What makes this specific example even more stunning and just awesome in general is that the watch did receive a Tiffany stamp from Tiffany Co, New York, which makes this watch very, very rare. What makes Tiffany stamps on watches rare is that what was happening is Tiffany, alongside of like brands like Cartier and some other companies into the 80s and into the 1990s, Tiffany was a jeweler. They weren't necessarily a brand at this point that was just solely selling their own jewelry, but they were doing things like stone setting, and they were also retailing things. So for example, back in the 1980s into the 1990s, Rolex was working with other authorized dealers, Ben Bridge, independent jewelers, and Tiffany, to ultimately retail their watches. Tiffany, alongside of Cartier and a couple of other very prestigious jewelers, would often remove the dials upon receiving them and then co-brand them with their logos, which makes them incredibly rare. Now, why is this rare? Why does this fetch a premium? Well, for starters, a lot of what inflates price with Rolex is number of total units produced. Now, a watch that has Tiffany on it really limits the amount of production myopically, because how many Rolex 16750s was Tiffany ultimately receiving and then retailing? Very, very small amount. Matter of fact, I've only seen, in terms of glossy 16750s, I think 5 of them ever surface. Not to say that there aren't more of them out there, but just to give you that perspective, there are thousands of 16750s out there. There's an even smaller number of 16750 spider dials out there, and there's an even smaller number of unpolished, co-branded 16750s in existence. So that makes this one very, very rare. And that's ultimately what kind of creates that exclusivity and also that demand among Tiffany dials, being that they were stamped by Tiffany. Another thing that's very interesting to point out is that Rolex was not doing the stamping of these dials. Tiffany was doing that. So what would happen is Tiffany would receive their inventory of watches, remove the dial from the case, and then co-brand the dial, and then ultimately retail the watches. And what also is interesting is I have a feeling, and I've also seen this, that a lot of watches didn't receive the Tiffany co-branding. So there were watches that just didn't go to the watchmaker at Tiffany, didn't receive that co-branding. They were retailed by Tiffany, but ultimately didn't bear the Tiffany stamp. Now, when authenticating Tiffany Co stamps, there are a couple of different font profiles that are common within co-branded Tiffany's and other brands or other co-branded watches. And it's taken a lot of time to develop this eye for these things, but there are definitely key characteristics that I look for when authenticating a Tiffany stamped dial. One thing that's very interesting is that the texture and the color of the font between the Rolex factory stamping, so the Oyster perpetual date or the superlative chronometer text, is actually different than Tiffany. And the reason for this is that they were done at separate times, and the ink, if you want to call it that, or lacquer that was used to print the dial and then ultimately stamp Tiffany is different. So when I'm looping that, you'll see a slight variation in Tiffany Co, and then the font that was ultimately used by Rolex to print the dials as they left the factory. Another thing that's really interesting is there is a bit of a sloppiness to the text, if that makes sense, for Tiffany. Rolex being very meticulous and having a mechanized process in place to print these dials was able to ultimately refine the font details and characteristics. Now with Tiffany and even Cartier, there are a couple tells, and the thing that is funny about that is I'm actually looking for that sloppiness when I'm authenticating a Tiffany dial, because Tiffany did not have the same ability and or process that Rolex did, or let's say the parent company, whether it be a Patek or something like that, when they were co-branding the dials. So you'll see that. Another interesting key characteristic is the shape of the Fs. The Fs in Tiffany look different, and also the T. The T kind of like swoops and droops down a little bit. The top bar of the T kind of tends to sag on the center post, which is the thing that I look for. And there's other elements that I could wax on about for hours and hours and hours. But generally speaking, those are the two key tells, I guess, when I'm looking at Tiffany dials. And those are consistent traits that I've seen in the matte dial range and the glossy dial range throughout a lot of the Tiffany stamped dials. The other thing that is really cool about this is that the spidering, so if you loop this watch, the spidering actually goes underneath the Tiffany Co text, which is something that I also look for when authenticating watches. I'm looking for that story, I'm looking for consistency, and I'm looking for that kind of commonality between, the vibe, the feel, the patina of the watch. In many cases, when things are done after the fact, or if you need, no doubt there are a lot of fake or replica Tiffany dials out there. In many cases, the person that is replicating those is trying to create this perfect thing, and in many cases that is far from the original, because there is this kind of error that I'm looking for in those font profiles and stuff like that. So one of the things that allows me to authenticate the Tiffany stamping on this is that the spidering actually goes underneath Tiffany and is also consistent with the other kind of overall age and patina that I'm seeing in this watch. Whereas if it was done later, it would look quite a bit different. Also, For me, the font profile of the aftermarket or non-genuine Tiffany's is worlds different than that of actual Tiffany stamped dials. So increasingly rare to find an original one, as again, not all of them were stamped, and also, you know, Tiffany as a retailer wasn't selling as many 16750s or just as many Rolexes in general as, let's say, like a Ben Bridge was in the later part of the 1980s. Incredible, incredible watch. I'm really honored and excited to bring this to you guys here, even matching down to the date code on the D-Link 62510. H Jubilee, you know, 50 stamped on the end of the bracelet, 550 ends. It's just a really, you know, awesome, complete example that also is very sharp and very original in condition. So I'll provide a link in the description below so that you guys can check this out and kind of familiarize yourself with Tiffany stamped watches. But this one is a case study example of what you should look for in a watch that is also unpolished out of this era, and again, wanted to highlight and share that with you guys. So as always, guys, thanks for tuning in. Appreciate the love and the support. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you've got watch questions, we're here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailor.com. And if you're not doing so already, be sure to follow us on Instagram. Thanks again, guys, for tuning in, and I will see you in the next one.